It's a really big honor to bring out our next guest. Just a bit of a background for those who may not know Albert Woodfox's story. He is one of the Angola Three, one of three people that were held in solitary confinement for decades because of their involvement with the Black Panther Party, becoming political prisoners. A few years ago, Albert was released and just wrote this really incredible book about his life called Solitary. And this title really says it all. And I'm going to use this as a way to introduce him. Solitary, unbroken by 4 decades in solitary confinement. My story of transformation and hope. Can we please give a big spotlight welcome to Albert Woodfox. Thank you very much. Yourself at home.
Redemption song. Redemption song.
Albert, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. I, over the last few weeks, have read this book and now very familiar with you on a much deeper level. I believe that your story is a very important one to get out into the world, and it's actually my opinion that writing this book is an incredible gift to the world. And
Well,
I think,
thank you. Yeah.
I think it's going to do a lot of good. You say a lot here, my story of transformation and hope, and I want to talk more about that in the next 20 minutes. You're from New Orleans.
Yes, born and raised.
And before we get to the transformation part, when you were a teenager, you had a lot of run-ins with the law, right?
Yeah, reasonable, I would, I think, people of my generation have a better feel of what institutional, individual, and systemic racism is, and the effects it can have on the lives of, particularly African Americans in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And so at that time, the opportunities and hopes and dreams were almost non-existence. I had no role models. I had no individuals to inspire me. My inspiration came from the streets. I became a petty criminal. The people I was inspired by were the people that were committing crimes against our own community.
And that changed, and this is one of the first stories, and you talk about this in your book, of transformation. And I'm talking about when you were introduced to the Black Panthers. Can you tell us about that?
Well, in the 60s, I had pretty much everybody in the country had a peripheral knowledge of the Black Panther Party. But eventually my petty criminal life caught up with me, and I was sentenced to 50 years in prison, and I escaped and wound up in Harlem. I went to Harlem because I was familiar with Harlem from the days, my criminal life. But this was a different Harlem, This Harlem was now occupied by members of the Black Panther Party. And, for the first time, I always say for the first, up until that point, I had always noticed in African Americans a certain fear. It was always right there below the surface, because we knew that whatever we achieved could be crushed, whatever we loved could be taken away, and that we had no opportunities, no hope. And so, but this was different, I seen these young black men and women moving around the neighborhood, and I didn't see that fear, and that was shocking and amazing to me, to see, you know, for the first time in my life, you know, African American people without fear and determination, you know. And so, in all honesty, you know, it was the sisters that, you know, first got my attention, you know, and and you know, so you know, later on, I realized that the beauty that so impressed me was the inner beauty. It wasn't the outer beauty; it was the inner beauty, you know. And so that was my first up close and personal contact with the party. And eventually, you know, I started going around the office in Harlem and the Panther headquarters, and eventually I was arrested on the extradition warrant.
Yeah.
Yeah, and while I was in the, it's called the Tombs, Manhattan House of Detention, 4 members of the Black Panther Party had been placed on the tier. And so right off, you know, automatically they started introducing themselves and talking about revolution and, you know, holding political classes and stuff, you know. And so, you know, I was listening at what they were saying, but I wasn't hearing what they were saying. Yeah. And, you know, I had a guy come down from upstate New York, and he had a book that made a difference in my life. It was a book called A Different Drummer. And up to that point, I never thought that one individual could make a difference, you know. But this book, it was a fictional piece of work based upon actual facts, which was the migration of African people from the South, you know, to up north, West Coast, East Coast, you know, because they thought this was the promised land, you know. Sadly, when they got there, they found out that the only thing that had changed was their location, you know. And so, but in this book, you know, I realized that one individual could make a change, that one individual could, you know, influence other people, you know, and
those were the seeds to a change inside of you.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, part of what I see as transformation, you know, was, you know, when I was placed in solitary confinement in 1972, my cell was meant to be a death chamber. You know, it was meant to be a place where I would either go insane, or I would, you know, hurt myself or take my own life, as so many other men had did. But, you know, I chose to make that cell into a school, a university, a law school, a debate hall, you know. And so that was part of the transformation, you know, where my way of thinking, you know, I become politicized by the party. And I began to understand the social and the economic, political, and social forces that had shaped my life. And that I realized for the first time, you know, that, you know, who I was not who I could be. You know, that I had been reacting to the conditions in America rather than, you know, taking control of my life and making plans and stuff. You know, so eventually that's what I started doing, you know.
Now, I just want to back up in time a little bit before you were placed in solitary, and you and Herman Wallace had started a chapter of the Black Panther Party at Angola Prison, and you were doing the work there in the worst of conditions. And can you tell us about some of those brutal conditions that you all were organizing against?
Well, in that time, I think the Justice Department had just designated Angola as the bloodiest prison in America. And almost every day, someone was being stabbed or bludgeoned or killed or raped, or, you know. It was total chaos, you know, total terror, brutality, you know, and the prisoners were put in a position where either they were a victim or a victimizer, you know, and there was no middle ground, you know. So you were either preying on someone or you were being preyed on by someone, and that was the kind of environment that, you know, I walked into. and Angola was segregated at the time. So you had, just like society, you had two sets of rules. You had the rules for white America and you had the rules for black America. So, I felt that, as a member of the Black Panther Party, and the philosophy of the party was to bring people together, regardless of the color of their skin or their ethnicity. So that's one of the things, I started to do, to try to bridge gaps between black prisoners and white prisoners, and to show them that, we all had a common enemy. And that enemy was, racism, exploitation, brutality, murder, and that we were being, the prisoners themselves were being used by the prison administration and security force to divide and conquer one another. And so a lot of the stuff that was going on, was sanctioned by either security or the administration or both. And one of them was, you had this thriving sexual slave market going on, in which young men coming into the prison system were being raped and forced to live a life of a prostitute, for lack of a better word. And you had other prisoners and security people, and in some cases administration people, who directly benefited from this. So these.
And you were working in these conditions to try to make things better and try to make this a safer place for people in the prison.
Yeah, well, we try to create a humane environment. I mean, one of the things that the party taught me is that I had a sense of self-worth. And, because I was in prison didn't mean that I wasn't worth something as a human being. And I had a right, to have dignity, pride, self-respect. But I had to work hard to develop these qualities of humanity. And so, I did this, and as a result of that, prison guard, in 1972, they found a prison guard who had been stabbed to death. And because of our, Harmon and I activity, we automatically became the primary suspect. And I was actually the first one they locked up for an investigation.
And you go into great detail about this, and this is a really well-known story, and it's a very interesting story, but there was no physical evidence tying you or Herman Wallace to this murder that you both were convicted of, and also there was evidence that was never checked out. There was
bloody fingerprints. Yeah.
And that didn't match your fingerprints or Herman's or anybody that was part of the investigation. But they didn't check all these other people on the tier, did they?
They wasn't, they wasn't interested. They had, their victims, and this was payback time for all the organizing and the activities, political activities that were going on in the prison because of me and Herman. And later Robert King, who make up the Angola Three.
And Robert King wasn't at Angola
wasn't even
when
in the
this
prison
murder happened.
But
he still had to.
When he came in, when he processed into Angola, they put him in solitary, along with Herman and I, for investigation of a murder that happened. He wasn't even in the prison, and he remained there for 29 years.
And solitary confinement's not something that's supposed to be used in a way where you're keeping somebody there for weeks and months and years, and in your case, longer than anybody else in this nation's history, I've heard, over 43 years.
Solitary confinement, there have been pro and cons arguments of its existence and its use. Being a victim of it, and being, I actually was in solitary confinement 44 years and 10 months. And so, I can tell you from personal experience, solitary confinement has no penological purpose. Its only purpose, if anything, is to destroy humanity, to destroy the individual, to take away his dignity, pride, his self-respect, to take away his hope, and to break his spirit, And I don't know if anyone here have ever seen a human being who had his spirits broke is the saddest thing in the world. And this was one of the things that inspired me to form an anti-rape squad, because a young kid that was in the dorm I was housed in had been raped on what's called Fresh Fish Day. And he was sitting across from me, and it was, in life, I truly believe in life that acts of individuals or events raise your level of consciousness. And once your level of consciousness is raised, you can never go back the way you was before. And so looking at this young kid, and for the first time in my life, realizing the detriment of taking away a human spirit, breaking it. It's something you can never get. Once a human being's spirit has been broken, it's something you can never get back. He may recover, he may achieve certain things, or she may achieve certain things, but you can never get back that spirit, that part of you that's the essence of, for me, I call it the essence of your soul, because it will always be there, Without that knowledge itself that you have been broken as a human being.
What tools did you use to keep from being broken? Living in a 6x9 cell for...
Well, I think what was unique for Herman and I is we both had joined the Black Panther Party, and we both had our level of conscience raised. We had been politicized, and we begun to understand how the forces of society work. When I say forces, I'm talking about the economic institutions, political institutions, and the social institutions in this country, and the effect that it had, and particularly on African Americans, other minorities, and the poor. So, I began to realize, like Robert has a saying that, I was in prison. Prison is not in me. And so I began to realize that I had a right to have moral principles and values. I had a right to, to have dignity and pride, self-respect. I had a right, to demand to be treated a certain way. And that the fact that I was in prison, one thing used to always make me angry is prison officials and district attorneys and police, they always get on TV and they say, well, in the name of the people, Well, my mom had nothing to do with me being sent to prison and being brutalized and being locked in solitary confinement for 40-something years. She had nothing to do with young kids being raped and forced sold into sexual slavery. She had nothing to do with individual racism acted upon me by racist prison guards who ancestry go back to chattel slavery. And for most people don't know, Angola is a form of plantation. Right. And you have generations of family that work there right now that go back all the way to chattel slavery. So their attitudes and their views about blacks in particular is shaped by what is being passed from one generation to the next generation. And so you had all, this is one of the things that made Angola such a bloody prison, such a torture chamber, for lack of a better word.
And using the word torture, the United Nations considers solitary confinement and prolonged solitary confinement as torture, and you know this firsthand. Just briefly, tell us why solitary confinement is torture.
Well, as I said earlier, the sole purpose of solitary confinement is to break an individual, to break the human spirit. You're confined to a 9x6 cell for 23 hours out of a 24-hour period. Over the decades, because of protests and demonstrations by prisoners that we helped organize, there was some changes in solitary as far as, TVs and being able to have a radio or get a newspaper and stuff. All these things didn't exist when we first were put in solitary.
There's one story I really like where you were in solitary confinement and they would serve you food. They would put it under the cell, slide it
Door.
across
Yeah, they would
the
put it on the floor.
dirty ground.
Yeah, and slide it under the door of the
And
cell.
You changed that, where in an environment where you just have so little agency, so little at your disposal to make a change, but you were able to effect a change so that they had to put in slots so they could serve you
Yeah.
more humanely. How did you make that happen?
Well, we went on a 45-day hunger strike. And then we ate through the bars for 18 months.
So you would hold the
Hold a tray in your hand
and then have to.
and eat with the other hand, rather than, be fed in an undignified and inhumane way. Having our food placed on the floor and slid under the door. And again, as I firmly believe that in life, it's either the act of an individual or a mass movement that caused change. And what inspired us and what raised our level of conscience, this was an undignified way of being fed, is one day one of the guys' tray was slid under the door, and some of the dirt from the cell door had fell in his food. And so he was trying to explain to the security man and get another tray. And he was cursed and threatened with being put in the dungeon and stuff, And so everybody listening at this, and me and Robert in particular, me and Robert King, because we were on the same tier at that time. And we like, I'm not eating under the door again, ever again. And so, we petitioned the administration and asked them to cut food slots. And after about 2 weeks, it was obvious that they had no intention of responding. So we, talked about it with everybody on the tier. And so we said, well, rather than eat food that's pushed on a dirty, filthy door, we won't eat it all until they cut food slots. And so we wound up, as I said, not eating for 45 days. And then after they made a concession that they would cut food slots, we said, well, we're not going to eat under the door. Can we stand and eat through the bars? And they said, well, we don't care how you eat. Of course, we never thought it would be 18 months later.
Wow.
So for 18 months, we ate through the bars.
Well, Albert, I'm really glad that you're no longer locked up. And I think it was inspiring and amazing to me, like in those worst of worst conditions, how you were still able to help others, that you risked a lot to try to make even any incremental change, to get slots in this solitary confinement. And now you're a free man, and you had the opportunity to write. This is an incredible book. It's an incredible story. I recommend that everyone goes out and buys this after the show and reads this and shares the story. I think after reading this, you'll understand why we have no reason. Solitary confinement has no place, in our society, and maybe start thinking about other ways we can treat people more humanely. Albert, what for you, now that you have opportunities like this to sit on a couch and have your own home in New Orleans East and travel and spend time with your family and your brother, what's the best part about being free?
Well, one of the things when we were first placed in solitary confinement, Harmon and Robert and I realized that men and women in prison and children had no voice, and people never saw them, so therefore they had no face. So we made a solemn vow to ourselves and to a social struggle that when, not if, when we went free, We would spend the rest of our lives being that voice and being that face, and make people remember that prisoners do not come from another planet. They come from your household. It starts with coming from the womb of your mother, and you are part of a family. And to make people realize that there are premeditated, deliberate economic policies in this country that guarantee that prisons will be prosperous. Now you have private prisons now in which they are for-profit prisons, and they're trading on Wall Street. So if the concept of the theory of rehabilitation ever existed, it don't exist anymore, because now every man, woman, and child that's placed in a prison bed represent dollars and cents for some other human being, usually the super rich, because they're the ones that can afford to trade on Wall Street. And so, what I'm doing now, since I've been out a little over 3 years now. And of course, we lost Herman Wallace. 3 days after he won his freedom, he died from liver cancer. And, so Robert, Hillary King, and I are the remaining living members of the A3. We're trying to fulfill that vow we made to one another. So I've traveled the world and across America, and I will continue to do that until the ancestors say it's time to come home.
Well, Albert, thank you very much for spending your evening with us. And
thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Absolute honor to have you on the show. Another round of applause for Albert Woodfox. Thank you very much.
Thank you.